In the year 1258, the city of Baghdad stood as the unrivaled heart of the Islamic world, a radiant center of culture, scholarship, and prosperity. For over 5 centuries, it had represented the height of human achievement, a place where ideas flourished, science expanded, and art and architecture reached extraordinary heights. Baghdad was not merely a city, it was the very symbol of civilization. Its fall, therefore, was not simply the conquest of a territory, it was the extinguishing of an age. Baghdad, jewel of the Abbasid Golden Age. Baghdad was founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, who envisioned a capital that would reflect both the unity of the Muslim world and the divine legitimacy of Abbasid rule. The city was designed as a giant circle with the Caliph's palace and the great mosque placed at its center, symbolizing both political and spiritual authority radiating outward. The circular design was both practical and ideological, a physical manifestation of order and harmony. Over the centuries, Baghdad became the most advanced metropolis of its time. Merchants arriving from Persia, China, Africa, and India filled its markets with luxurious textiles, exotic spices, precious metals, and rare manuscripts. The streets of the city were lit at night, hospitals provided organized medical care, and clean water flowed through engineered canals. It was a city that not only welcomed scholars, poets, physicians, philosophers, and mathematicians, it celebrated them. The crown of Baghdad's intellectual brilliance was the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, founded in the early 9th century. Here, scholars of many cultures and faiths gathered to translate, analyze, debate, and expand upon works from ancient Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. It was in Baghdad that algebra was formulated by al-Khwarizmi, optics revolutionized by Ibn al-Haytham, and medical science expanded through rigorous study and documentation. Knowledge was not only preserved, but reinvented. By the mid-13th century, Baghdad was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population approaching 1 million. It was a thriving capital of learning and culture. Yet this flourishing city, radiant with libraries, plazas, gardens, and mosques, was about to face a force unlike any it had encountered: the rise of the Mongol storm. Far to the east, across the vast plains of Central Asia, a new empire had been forged under the leadership of Genghis Khan. By uniting the Mongol tribes into a single disciplined force, Genghis Khan had created an army of extraordinary mobility, resilience, and ruthlessness. These warriors lived in the saddle, raised in a world of harsh winters and unforgiving landscapes that hardened them in body and will. Their military methods were revolutionary, emphasizing speed, psychological warfare, and strategic deception. They could travel faster than any army before them, and they fought with precision that terrified their enemies. The Mongols had already conquered northern China, Persia, and Central Asia. Cities that resisted their rule were annihilated entirely, their populations massacred, and their lands left in ruins. The message was always clear: submit and live, resist and perish. Genghis Khan's descendants continued this expansion after his death, and by the 1250s, the Islamic world was the next target. Mongol Khan, the Great Khan at the time, ordered his brother Hulagu to extend Mongol rule across the Middle East and to subdue Baghdad itself. A caliphate unprepared, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, al-Mustasim, ruled a state that still possessed great wealth and symbolic importance, but little real military power. The once unified Islamic world had fractured into rival kingdoms and sultanates, many of which distrusted one another far more than they feared the Mongols. When Hulagu sent his demand for Baghdad's surrender, promising safety in exchange for submission, al-Mustasim refused, believing that no Muslim ruler would dare abandon the caliphate in its moment of need. He trusted in tradition, prestige, and divine protection. But faith would not stop what was coming. The Islamic world did not unite. No armies marched to Baghdad's defense. The Mongols, who cared nothing for religious authority, advanced. The siege and breach. Hulagu's army was immense, perhaps numbering more than 150,000 fighters, accompanied by engineers, siege specialists, and auxiliary forces from conquered peoples. They surrounded Baghdad and cut it off from the outside world. The Caliph attempted to mount a defense by sending his troops across the Tigris River to attack the Mongols, but the Mongols, prepared and calculating, diverted the river and flooded the battlefield. Countless soldiers drowned, and the remnants fled back in terror. In late January 1258, siege engines constructed by Chinese engineers began to pound Baghdad's walls. Stones weighing hundreds of pounds crashed against the city day and night. Disease-ridden corpses were hurled over the walls to spread sickness and fear. Firepots burst into flames upon impact, igniting buildings across the city. Within days, breaches appeared in the mighty walls that had defended Baghdad for centuries. Realizing the hopelessness of his position, al-Mustasim attempted to negotiate surrender. But by then, the Mongols had no interest in mercy. Hulagu wanted to ensure that Baghdad could never again rise as a symbol of Islamic unity. The sack of Baghdad. On February 13, 1258, the Mongols entered the city, and the horror that followed is remembered as one of the greatest tragedies in recorded history. For 7 days, Baghdad was turned from a living city into a wasteland of corpses and ashes. Soldiers slaughtered civilians in the streets. Women were assaulted and enslaved. Children were killed without hesitation, and entire families were wiped out where they lived. The destruction was systematic, thorough, and unrelenting. The mosques and palaces that defined Baghdad's skyline were stripped of their beauty and set aflame. The great markets, once alive with the noise of trade, fell silent under the ruin of fire and rubble. Even sanctuary and sacred places offered no safety, for the Mongols did not recognize the holiness of the buildings they tore apart. The destruction of the House of Wisdom. The greatest cultural and intellectual disaster was the destruction of the House of Wisdom. The vast collection of manuscripts, scientific treatises, historical records, and philosophical works, many of which existed nowhere else, were thrown into the Tigris River or burned. Chroniclers later wrote that the river ran black with ink as centuries of accumulated knowledge dissolved and drifted away. The memory of human discovery, carefully recorded and preserved for generations, vanished in a matter of days. This was not merely the destruction of a city's library, it was the silencing of a civilization's voice. The end of the Abbasid Caliphate. After witnessing the ruin of his city, al-Mustasim's fate was sealed. Hulagu ordered the Caliph's execution, and to avoid spilling royal blood on the earth, a Mongol taboo, he was wrapped in carpets and trampled by horses. With his death, the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad ended, and the political and spiritual unity of the Islamic world was shattered. A ceremonial Abbasid line would later be established in Cairo, but it wielded no real power. The era in which Baghdad served as the shining capital of global civilization was gone. The world after the fall. The fall of Baghdad marked far more than the end of a dynasty. It represented a profound shift in global history. The Islamic Golden Age, which had fostered advancements in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and literature, came to an abrupt and violent close. The intellectual center of the world moved elsewhere, eventually shifting toward Europe, where the knowledge that survived would help spark the Renaissance. Baghdad would be rebuilt in time, but it would never return to the role it once held. Too many scholars had been killed, too many manuscripts destroyed, too many institutions dismantled. The vibrant cultural ecosystem that had defined the city for centuries could not be recreated simply by rebuilding its walls. The lesson of Baghdad. The story of Baghdad's fall is ultimately a lesson in the fragility of civilization. A city that had taken centuries to develop into a beacon of knowledge and enlightenment was undone in a single week. The achievements of generations were scattered to the wind. What was lost was not just buildings or artifacts. It was the accumulated wisdom of humanity. Civilization endures only when its people protect it. Knowledge exists only so long as we value it. Baghdad reminds us that progress is not inevitable, and that the light of human achievement can be extinguished far more easily than it can be kindled. And so, the fall of Baghdad is not merely a historical tragedy, it is a warning. And so, the fall of Baghdad in 1258 remains one of the most tragic turning points in human history. If this story moved you, give this video a like, Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support really helps us continue exploring the forgotten chapters of our past. And remember, history is not just something that happened, it's something we are still living. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next journey.